What's going on, sophomores? It's the Tuesday, May 26th, about 10:08 a.m. here. Um, Relatively longer video today. We're talking about the Age of Terrorism. There's only two more videos today and then tomorrow's video, and that's it. That's all I have for you. In the era of coronavirus, it's definitely sped up um, the semester, and it's unfortunately a lot of the stuff I wanted to do with you that takes more time and in class I just can't do with you right now virtually. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna talk about the rise of the age of terrorism tomorrow. That pretty much takes us from about kind of 9/11 up to like the 2010s. Then we talk about everything kind of right before Trump to uh, coronavirus. That's where we're going tomorrow. Okay. Um, and then that's that. All right. So let's get into it. Okay. So, um, before coronavirus, before what we're in right now, um, the greatest uh, challenge and threat and world-changing event that's happened in my lifetime. I was going to say our lifetimes, but I think you were born right after this. Is 9/11, and we got to understand why 9/11 happens, the fallout from 9/11, because up until the time we're in now, it's been the most influential, world-changing event. It's completely altered the landscape of geopolitics, international relations between countries. A lot of you could kind of point the you could kind of follow the trail of breadcrumbs that kind of led to the rise of like what we see like in Trump followers, low key kind of back to 9/11. So a lot of the world we're living in now is actually kind of a fallout from everything post 9/11 world. Well, we first got to understand, well, why did 9/11 happen? So we got to talk about the rise of this age of terrorism. So terrorism, first off, is when someone typically is going to use physical violent force to strong arm someone into doing what that person wants them to do. It's to manipulate someone. That's essentially what terrorism is. Is And terrorism can come in many different ways. Terrorism can be, you know, we often think of the word terrorism and terrorists just exclusively for the Arab world or radical Islamic terrorists, but terrorist events happen regardless of skin color, gender, nationality, religion, etc. I mean, in the United States, we've had a lot of especially in the past 10 years, kind of a rise of like white nationalist like terrorism groups. The idea of like the school shooters is a kind of a part of terrorism. Um, in a way. So terrorism can manifest itself in many different ways. So before I even go any further, not every terrorist is someone that is of like a radical Islamic Arab kind of background. But in the sense of world history and what's changed the world since 9/11 is the most one of the most significant events in world history, and it was carried out by radical Islamic terrorists. The fallout from that um, is going to be centered around kind of the rise of like the radical Islamic terrorism group. That's why when you think terrorist, you think of most people think of like a radical Islamic Arab person versus like the white school shooter. Um, and that has to do because 9/11 was such a big event, and that's imprinted in so many of our minds. Okay. So before I go any further, just want to make sure we understand that. Now, talking to how it specifically ties in with 9/11, most of the Arab world, as we've kind of talked about, is angry at the Western powers, especially Europe and the United States following World War II. The Europeans in the United States, and I don't do a good enough job of really teaching you this, but the Europeans in the United States, took advantage of the Middle East, essentially colonized and imperialized the entire region for their oil. The creation of Israel on Arab land, right? The Israel Palestinian conflict it was kind of seen as like the really big last straw. And since we've supported Israel, especially the United States, since its creation, it's always been kind of a natural conflict between us and the Arab world. Oop, I'm going too far ahead. Um, as a result, um, you know, uh, radical Islamic groups rose up um, and kind of fought back against um, like the Western worlds and um, tried to incite revolutions in their country um, to bring like in their eyes the like groups like Al Qaeda and the Taliban. Um, they were trying to turn their countries into like a radical Islamic rule um, as the ultimate defiance to like the Western world. That's the purpose of ISIS and Al Qaeda and Taliban. Is it's to be ultimately defiant, to show the middle finger to the Western world. Um, Unfortunately, the way they go about handling their business is oftentimes through violence, especially against their own people. Um, and so, um, yeah, it's violent and dangerous uh, groups that exist in these parts of the world. Here we have ISIS right here, and then we have different like you have like this would be like either another terrorist group, could be Al Qaeda or Taliban, I'm not sure. Then you see like commonly, especially if you went back into the days of the Iraq War across the Middle East, a lot of people would be like down with the United States and down with Britain, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, there's all this hatred for the Western world. And now this anger now is like, okay, how are we going to really strike back against the West? And the most successful strike was 9/11. So 9/11, it's a date that is synonymous now in world history. If you had said it before 2001, no one would have understood what it meant. You say it now, you know what it means. You have images and symbols in your mind. A set of numbers, a date, creates a certain image and a certain emotion out of Americans and whatnot, and around the world. So, on September 11th, 2001, there were 4 American planes. They were hijacked by radical Islamic terrorists. 2 planes hit the Twin Towers. These were 2 very large buildings in New York City. At the time, they were actually the largest buildings in the world, I believe. And one plane hit the Pentagon. Uh, the Pentagon is where the United States government's, that's where the Department of Defense, that's their headquarters. So think of like the military headquarters of the United States. It's outside Washington, D.C. And then another plane landed in a field in Pennsylvania. Um, a lot of people think it probably would have been on its way to crashing into the White House. Over 3,000 people died on 9/11, most of which were killed in the collapsing of the Twin Towers. And it remains the worst attack ever on American soil. This is part of the class where I would show you like the videos and we'd look at all these things, but we can't do that right now and it just won't work. So instead, I suggest you do that on your own, especially because you were not alive for it and you don't remember, obviously, where you were and what it was like. I remember where I was. I think I was in the second, I might have been in the third grade. I was in the third grade because I was 8 years old. And I remember waking up because we would always wake up early. And you got to remember, New York in the East Coast is about 3 hours ahead of us. So 6 o'clock for us is like 9 o'clock for them. And obviously, I'm really young and I don't understand what's going on. But my parents, when I wake up, were watching the news and it looked like it was just a big fire. And I thought it was just a big fire. And I didn't understand until probably years after the full of what happened and that the United States was attacked and the planes were hijacked and they purposely landed into the plane, the towers and whatnot. And so, while I didn't understand really what was going on, vivid image of me walking out of my room Most of the house is dark except the lights that are on in our TV room when I walk out my door to the right, and it's on the TV. And I'll always remember that. And then I remember at school, which was hours later, and this was now like the buildings had collapsed, and the plane had landed in Pennsylvania, and we kind of were now learning that this was like not by accident, this was an attack. There's like a moment of silence. I remember having a moment of silence in class, and I forget her name. And she wasn't a very good teacher, but I remember being in that class and hearing the announcement. I remember the speaker. I remember that very vividly too. It's kind of crazy how long ago that was. Yet even as a young kid, I guess we knew it was going to be a big moment. To kind of understand, like, some people might ask, well, Mr. Tomei, how can like people just hijack a plane, or how does that happen? All of you have only ever lived in the time of TSA and extreme heightened security. But before 9/11, security at airports, while more heightened, were pretty relaxed. You used to be able to take on a bunch of liquids. You used to be able to not have to take off your shoes. You used to be able to have powders, all these different type of things you could just take onto the plane. You used to only have to walk through a pretty basic metal detector. You also used to be able to have, you could bring people with you all the way up to the gate. They didn't need to have a boarding pass, right? You just brought them up to the gate. Like, if you were going to say goodbye to your mom or dad or your girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, right? And you would walk them to the gate. There were restrictions, security, but it was nowhere near what we have today. The whole idea of the TSA and those people in blue uniforms didn't exist before 9/11. The whole body scanner image that goes around, that didn't exist, right? The liquids, the random pullouts for security checks when they randomly check your bag, none of that happened until 9/11. We're going to get more into that. But getting to the point is, how could someone hijack a plane? Limited security. The terrorists aren't dumb. They were planning for years to do this. They had already tried to take down the towers back in the early 90s in a bomb, but it was an unsuccessful attack. And then that was in 92 or 93, I think. And then so they tried again, and this time with planes. It was pretty simple. They had knives and kind of a either real or fake like bomb vest, and they stormed to the cockpit, and they either killed the pilots or threw them out, locked themselves into the cockpit, and then they steered themselves into these buildings. Again, to be able to do that, to know that what you're going to do is going to kill so many people, and it's going to kill yourselves, and probably not particularly the best way, shows how determined these individuals were. And that's why their plan was so successful, because they were determined and it was well planned, and it definitely took us in the United States by surprise, and really the world. This is kind of the fallout from, this is a famous picture that happens on that you'll see from 9/11. When the building started burning, a lot of people, oh, someone's calling me. There's no caller ID. A lot of people, as the buildings were burning, tried to escape. Some people who were high up, because the fire, they couldn't go through the fire down the building, they jumped out of desperation from talking probably 1,000 feet up maybe. Yeah, and so, I mean, there's videos of like people, you hear the people hitting the ground or hitting a car, kind of out of a movie. Or there's a famous photo of a guy, it almost looks like he's an angel, and he's falling head first, very kind of gracefully and stoic. You can look all this stuff up online. A lot of firefighters bravely went up to the buildings, fought through the smoke, trying to save people, but unfortunately the burning of the buildings caused the towers to kind of internally collapse. And the debris is kind of what they're covered in now. The debris has had long-term effects on people's health. these are buildings that were made many, many decades ago. They're full of like chemicals, especially asbestos, which is known to cause cancer. It's one of the worst chemicals that you can have in your system. And a lot of firefighters today, or people who were in and around that area, who are breathing in all the debris when the towers fell, they have huge high rates of like cancer and other kind of diseases and sicknesses that they've been plagued with. Emphysema, all these lung cancers, all these different types of things. And so it was a pretty tragic day in American history. And it's left behind a very endearing and important legacy. It's really changed the world. So the legacy of 9/11 is pretty much this. Arguably, it's one of the most important events in our modern world history. It's changed completely the way we travel. It's changed the entire airport game. It led to increased border security. It's changed the way we check boats and car. I mean, it's everything. We now have one of the world's, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. We have one of the world's greatest government surveillance programs now. We tap people's phones. It's the whole FBI guy meme who's watching your screen and stuff. I mean, we were doing that obviously before 9/11, but not to the extent that we're doing it now today, or in the way we're able to do it. It was a big justification and reason to go to war in the Middle East. George Bush at the time was concerned about terrorist groups in the Middle East and around the world, particularly in Iraq. There was a lot of concerns that individual named Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction that could then lead to another terrorist attack. And so we'll get to that too a little bit. Yeah. And so we went to war in the Middle East. That's a very controversial war, which we'll get to. And over time, a lot of people have come to hate or distrust like the Arab world, the Middle East, kind of Muslim people in general. You see on this graph right here, this anti-Islamic hate crime incidents. You see it's pretty limited up until 2001, and all of a sudden 2001, huge increase. And then even in the years following, pretty large compared to where it was before. You probably heard a couple years ago when Trump early on became president, he had the whole like Muslim travel ban. It wasn't to ban Muslims, but it was banning travel to and from countries that had mostly Muslim populations. Again, Trump said, "Oh, it's for national security," but in another lens, it can be viewed as kind of discriminatory or prejudice or racist. And so, yeah, the whole Trump aspect kind of gets weird too. We'll get to that in a second. This just goes to show you terrorist incidents around worldwide. Up until about the 80s, things were pretty low. There weren't that many number of incidences. And then over time, you've seen it's gone from being almost zero to none to at a high kind of around kind of the peak of ISIS in 13, 14, and so on, over 15,000 plus incidences. It's gone down. But I mean, you can tell, I mean, this is a problem that has really grown over the past 40 years or so. This shows you the countries with the most fatalities from terrorist attacks. The United States isn't even actually on the top list, but you'll see attacks and then fatalities. You'll see a lot of the Arab world is listed on here. So you have Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Syria. Then there's a few kind of random outliers like India, Sri Lanka, Thailand. Those are areas that have, for example, their own kind of problems. We kind of know the history of India and how certain like the Muslim groups have been kind of targeted there. Same with Pakistan. Sri Lanka has a similar case. Thailand also has similar issues. The Muslim religion is actually pretty popular in Southeast Asia. The largest Muslim country in the world is actually Indonesia. That has the most followers there in the entire world is in Indonesia. So a lot of people think when we think of just Muslim people, or we think only the Arab world, but there's actually a lot in Southeast Asia. There's a pretty significant population in the Philippines too, and there's been in I'm not exactly sure where, and this is where I wish I had some of my student experts in here who might know, but I know in the Philippines they've been really struggling for the past 10, 20 years, and they've had kind of radical Islamic terrorist groups in the south. I think I could be getting that wrong, that have caused some issues in the Philippines. So it's not just in the Middle East. It happens, Nigeria is in Africa, right? They have issues there as well. These are images from the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq was pretty much George Bush's and the country's mission at the time to eradicate the world of terrorism. And Iraq was considered one of the main places where terrorism and terrorist groups and cells were forming. So George Bush was really big in his followers, right? Was really big in going to war in Iraq. But as time went on, weapons of mass destruction, the numbers or the amount that we found was zero to negligible. And a lot of people began to be like, why are we here? Why are we in this war? Why are we fighting a war? And a lot of people became cynical. And then people started, making conspiracy theories saying it's all about oil. It's just to secure our oil reserves. And there's probably some truth into that. But the reason why we were able to go into war in the Middle East, and eventually we'll show you the war on terror, and the reason we're able to have the world's greatest government surveillance program, and why we have drones that are these robotic planes that can shoot people from thousands of feet up in the air, is because after 9/11, people were willing to elect individuals who were willing to go to war or increase government surveillance and increase security. It was like a cultural light switch that turned on in this country about protecting American values, the American way of life, the American culture. It was really the greatest time of patriotism since probably World War II in this country. And so that's what really allowed for people like George Bush to go and win an election, and all these other kind of Republican masses and conservative individuals to really rise up and take power in this country. And the longstanding effects from that are pretty big. We've been in a global war on terror since 2001. We've kind of led this war on terror. We've been in war with Afghanistan since 2001. It's finally coming to a close. Our original goal was to get rid of the Taliban, who had control in Afghanistan. We failed. We are now unable to defeat the Taliban, and we are leaving like a dog with its tail between its legs. And before coronavirus was going on, that was we were negotiating our exit from Afghanistan. So hundreds of billions, even more, I don't even know the exact number, spent on the war in Afghanistan to change nothing. So absolute failure. The Iraq War, kind of a failure in a way, because after we left Iraq in 2011, ISIS came and pretty much erased all the gains we made. Although we've kind of battled back and defeated ISIS, it's still, the Middle East has had a ton of issues, like in Syria with the Syrian civil war. Our original mission was, the original plan, and people at the time thought we could go to the Middle East, go over there and save it, and go to other places around the world and kick out evil. This whole idea of the axis of evil: Iran, North Korea, and Iraq. If we go ahead, Cuba also, actually, I should put that in there, was a part of that. We're going to go to these places and we're going to bring them democracy and show them the American way. It never happened like that. And the only thing really that this global war on terror has done is really caused insurmountable amount of loss of life from citizens alone, people in their own countries who have been probably killed, hundreds of thousands around the world, maybe even more. It's pretty impossible to get a for sure accurate number. And it's really, in a lot of ways, it's kind of led to like the idea of like stronger border security. and, you know, making America like great again and going back to way the things were in the 40s and the 50s. All those things for years have been brewing since 9/11, and then all of a sudden 2016 happens and you get Trump. And I think, in my opinion, there's a big correlation that can be made between those feelings after 9/11 in the country, and that's what planted the seeds for 15 years later for someone as out there as Trump and as horrible as Trump to become president. And that's what I think the 9/11 was a big part in that. And so, yeah, and we'll finish on this last slide. So, government surveillance, I kind of mentioned this earlier. The war on terror led to the increase in government surveillance around the globe. Technology allowed the government to spy on our calls, texts, emails. I guarantee you, if the government wanted to, they could watch this video right now. They could. They could listen in on this conversation. It's not past them. Wouldn't be that hard. There's a good video I would show you now in class. Unfortunately, I'm not going to show it to you, but it talks about how capable the government is of tracking you. Facial recognition is now kind of the new worry of, like, you know, when you put your iPhone up to your face, for the people who have the new iPhone, it's like now our faces are going to be tracked by all the cameras. Next time you go out, whenever we're able to go out again into the public or a downtown area, try and count how many cameras there are. Just look around if it ever comes to your mind. We're always being watched. We're always being tracked with our phones now. Anytime you type in Google anything, right, the government is watching. If they really wanted to, they could look in right now. So I included my memes. So look, it's like how to build a bomb, but chilled for a school project. FBI, nice save, bro. Dab. Right. I see you crying through your front camera, but I don't even blame you. I'm crying too. Right. Right. You've seen these memes. I'm young and lit. So that's where those memes kind of come from, and they actually come from real world stuff. And so this is like the age of terrorism. All this stuff from 9/11 to now, up and really to the coronavirus. It's changed the world. And I wish we were in class and we could do all these other cool activities, but unfortunately we can't. So, okay, it was a long video. I said it was going to be long. Please go ahead and watch it. I'll post one more video either tomorrow or Thursday, maybe just tomorrow to get it done with. And that'll be it. And then we'll kind of get ready for a final. And yeah, okay. If you have any questions or anything, let me know. And I will talk to y'all later. Take care.